Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Green Scare Pod. So today we're joined by a very special guest, Roger Yates. Roger Yates is a former lecturer in sociology at University College Dublin and University of Wales, and was also the Northern Press Officer for the Animal Liberation Front. Thank you so much for joining me, Roger.
It's a pleasure. How are you doing?
Oh, doing great. Um,
Well, that's the main thing.
of course. I want to say we just had Ronnie Lee on, and we were discussing about him. I love the
I know
podcast you do.
you poor thing, you poor thing.
I love the podcast you do with Ronnie Lee, and it's so interesting to me seeing like people involved in the early ALF commenting on like modern day vegan culture topics. So people like Cosmic Skeptic or Joey Carbstrong or the popularization of veganism in like consumer products like Impossible Meat, etc., which I think is tested on animals anyways. So yeah, I totally recommend anyone who's watching checks out the podcast that Roger and Ronnie do. I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's great.
Yeah, it's called Still Alive, which was Ronnie's
Still
idea.
live. Oh,
Because we're getting on, I mean, Ronnie's been vegan for 52 years, so
yeah, yeah. How long have you been vegan?
45.
45. Wow.
Mm.
So, Roger, you took part in the historic ALF raid, Operation Valentine, which involved over 100 people and took part in broad daylight. What was it like to do that?
Well, it was interesting because it was a kind of groundbreaking, and people are still debating whether it was a good idea because there was a division between the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, and a group called the NOW, which stands for Northern Animal Liberation League. They had a kind of ideological dispute, really, but I kind of bridged the gap, so I was involved with both. And I mean, a few people were, but I certainly was. But what you tended to have to do really was you adhere to the philosophy of the one that you were with at the time, as it were. But what we had with Operation Valentine was a mix match of ALF type activity, but as you said, in daylight, which is unusual because the NOW was always about getting information, and so they would stress things like minimal damage, whereas the ALF used to say, well, if you go to the trouble of getting into, for example, a laboratory, the least you could do is smash it up. So they had a different philosophy of what to do and how to go about it.
Right. Do you think that raid was effective, or um, do you have
Well,
any second thoughts looking back?
yeah, it created a lot of press. I mean, this was before the age of the internet, of course.
Mm.
So there's a lot of press, and even front page news on national, tabloids, for example. So in that sense, it was part and parcel of the kind of radicalization of the movement which was going on, because this was 1982. So you could really say 82, 83, probably 81 as well. This was one of the peaks of the movement, and some people would say, the highest of the peaks because everything was like full on in those days. I always got this anecdote at that time. Um, I remember somebody saying, we're going to have won in 10 years, and nobody thought that was an outrageous thing to say, right? Because everything was so full on. At the time, the grassroots were active. They were forming local groups and regional groups. These were supporting the national groups. The national groups were supporting the grassroots, a few kind of cash backhanders when necessary, and all this kind of stuff. And the grassroots used to kind of, I don't know, get into a laboratory, get some documents out, and then plonk them on the door of the national groups, and they would go, oh, look what we found on our doorstep, that's a surprise, and then it would end up in their newspapers. So there was like a relationship which was very kind of activist orientated in those days, even for the national groups.
I see. What was it like organizing the more ALF part of that raid and being involved in that?
Well, funny enough, I wasn't part of that. I was part of the outside part of
Oh,
it. Yeah, and so I didn't take part in the inside bit. I was kind of part of the kind of slowing the police down.
I
So
see.
when the cops arrived, they found like a demonstration outside, and so they weren't quite sure what this was,
Mm.
right? So they'd had reports that the laboratory was under attack, as it were, and then when they had turned up, there was lots of people just like demonstrators, and I was kind of part of those. So we were our job was effectively to slow them down to give the activists a chance to get away. And that worked quite well. And so I think a mixture of the inside people and the outside people ended up being arrested. I was one of those. And we got taken to a school gym, I think it was in the end, because there's so many of it. I think it was over 60 of us. And it was a time in those days when people used to use false names all the time. I used to have lots and lots of them. In fact, I used to have about 4 female false names, Jill Lockwood and Sarah Dean and all this kind of stuff. And it used to be when people used to get arrested, they used to always call themselves John Harris. And so I think there must have been about 30 John Harrises arrested that day, And so it takes the police a long time to sort all that out and then decide, were you, one of the people causing damage, or were you one of the people in the demo? What relationship was it between the two? Because of course the people outside were going, well, I didn't know what was going on inside, and
Mm.
a lot of them didn't either. So it was an interesting, the way that it used to be organized, certainly in the north with the NAL, is you used to get into a series of transit vans, and they would go, right, the target today is ICI. Do you want to go or not? Because this is the time when you can leave the event, right, and that kind of stuff. And then if you signed up by staying in the van, that's it, you're in. Then that's how it was organized,
Ah,
because again, you couldn't do it online because there wasn't any online.
I see. So, you were part of the Animal Liberation Front support group, which at one point had its own physical office, from what I've heard.
Yes, it was down in Hammersmith in London. I used to visit that a couple of times. But the reason that I was in London mainly was the fact that I was a committee member of a group called BUAV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And so I was also running an animal rights shop in Liverpool
Ah,
at the time. And so there was a lot going on. I would go down for committee meetings, check in with Ronnie. I would also go to a place called Animus, who produce a lot of badges and stuff. And we would get all the sales goods from all the groups on a sale or return basis. So I would take them back to Liverpool, back to the animal rights shop, which we think is probably the first one in the world, really, because it was all solely based on animal advocacy, you know. And then we started to introduce things like fluffy toys and this kind of stuff, because what we would do, we did a deal with these. I'm not quite sure how to describe them, but these groups that would be a therapeutic event for people with disabilities,
hmm.
and they would make things like fluffy toys, and so we were able to support them as well as supporting the shop. So we did all that in the end, So like I said, there was a lot going on.
So, what was it like to report on the ALF's actions in the early days, and did this get you into legal trouble?
Well, we were very naive, to be honest. And see, Ronnie was the national press officer, and he was before me, and he didn't really want to do it, I don't think. And he was just kind of pushed into it in the sense that everybody knew who he was, so he couldn't be an activist anymore. So I was like an activist in the north, and Ronnie knew me, and he found that the workload was so intense that he couldn't keep up with it, because there was some really big and controversial things going on at the time, and so he was almost like on the national news and the TV bulletins, every hour on the hour and this kind of stuff. And so he couldn't really keep up. So he said, would you do the north of England and Scotland kind of thing? And I kind of said no. And then I'd read Tom Reagan, The Case for Animal Rights, and I realized, and I suppose this was the beginning of my understanding of social movements a little bit, I realized that an activist group like the ALF would kind of punch a hole through an issue, and then the rest of the movement could, follow through, as it were. So
Right.
I figured that I could use the activities of the activists as a means of explaining to the public what animal rights was. It's just that it's very difficult because the journalists want to concentrate on the action. They don't want to concentrate on the philosophical background to it. So there was always a struggle, really, you know. So it was interesting. I think it was a case by case. Sometimes we had a very successful kind of interchange with the mass media, and other times they would just, especially when things changed, like we used to get headlines, and I'm sure Ronnie has told you this, really kind of positive headlines,
Yeah.
and then it all changed, and suddenly we became, the T word, and of course, as soon
Mm.
as you get that label successfully attached to you, then the journalists change their tone with you, right? And then the national groups that I mentioned, they also start to get jittery, and so they start to attack you as well. So there was a definite kind of shift. And then another weird thing, which is part of this story, is the fact that when some of the action groups rejected the non-violence stance of the ALF, because it was always a non-violence situation. So you got groups like the Justice Department, Animal Rights Militia, and the Hunt Retribution Squad. They actually were openly violent, right?
Mm.
Or claimed that they would be, and all this kind of stuff. And that actually helped us. It helped me as a press officer, because you'd go and you go, hello, I'm Roger Yates, and I'm Northern Press Officer of the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group and all that. And he goes, oh yeah, you're the ones who just break into things and smash things up. You're not the ones who are violent. And
Mm.
so it was like a hierarchy, kind of like we came down, in terms of militancy, and that's just the way that the media operates.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. You brought up the T word. It is surreal to me seeing some of the people that's applied to, and it just completely, it's just completely inappropriate when we look at actual real terrorism. Like the early 2000s here in the U.S. were marked by a period of repression against the animal and earth movements, and it was known as the Green Scare, and this led to yeah, just huge, amounts of people who are active in these movements being considered terrorists. Did you experience something similar in the UK, and how do you think that and the Green Scare affected animal activism?
Yeah, it was, I think it was a deliberate policy which culminated in them just mass arresting us, really.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that they realized that there was something happening, and that direct action and the reasons for it were becoming popular, and this was outside of the animal movement as well. The miners were on strike, and there was a lot of stuff going on. There's some kind of inner city riots in places, and so there was a lot of kind of I don't know, lefty agitation, maybe you could say, which we were all kind of really kind of part and parcel of. We would rock against racism, rock against sexism, we anti-apartheid. We would all be involved with all of that, and so there was then a shift, and I suppose the ultimate cause of that was the election of Margaret Thatcher,
Hmm.
which was the beginning in Britain of neoliberalism. And so then you've got a different kind of, there's no such thing as society, and yet we were a social movement. you know it's all to do with individuals, and yet we were a collective. So we were butting our heads against the people who wanted to run the country. And of course, then once they found out that these troublemakers are being successful, or at least were growing or something, they would want to do something about you, and they
Hmm.
would want to either arrest you. And what they did in our trial, which I'm sure you covered with Ronnie, was they mainly wanted to shut us up. And so it was the press people like me and Ronnie that
This was
got
the
the bigger
trial in
sentences.
Sheffield, right?
Sheffield, yeah,
Right.
that's right. And so they wanted to shut us up. And so the actual activists who were doing the business, as it were,
Hmm.
they got suspended sentences or small sentences. The ones who were involved with the putting the stuff out, the propaganda side of it, they're the ones who got the big sentence, particularly Ronnie, who got 10 years. And I remember going,
That's sort of
I,
scary for me to hear, considering my role in the movement.
I don't worry. It's a piece of cake
Oh,
in
of
some
course,
ways,
continue.
but yeah, I remember we all had a meeting with our barristers because there was several barristers and all that. And I remember me and Ronnie have got a slight difference here. I remember Ronnie got told he was going to get 16 years. He thinks he was told he was going to get 15. I was told that I was going to get 10 years, right? And so I was the only defendant with children. And so I was thinking, wow, that's my kid's education, right? And so that's why in the parlance, I kind of went on my toes. In other words, I absconded from court for a couple of years. And the reason for that is the fact that I thought, I can't afford to be in the nick for 10 years.
Hmm.
And then I ended up working at an organic farm. And the funny thing about that was that on the day that I was sentenced in my absence, it was on the TV. I was working on the farm, and the farmer called me in to see my sentence on the TV. And so it's going, Roger, your sentence is on TV. So I ran in, and there it was on the news. The one person who wasn't there was me. And the weird thing was, and I didn't know this until much later when I read it in a zine, that the court had forgotten about me, including including I know, including the judge. And then suddenly, just before he kind of went bang, that's the end of the trial. Somebody went, hang on a minute, there's somebody else, kind of thing. And if he'd have beaten that, then they couldn't do anything with me then. But unfortunately, it wasn't the case. So there you go.
Wow, that's amazing. That does happen often here in the US as well. A lot of times, smaller activists, because, I mean, the government does want to prosecute them, but it's really just for public show or to put the pressure on. They'll just, after a while, lose interest, and they might even know who the person is while they're on the run and where they are, but they don't, they don't act on it.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing I learned in my years, that part of my career, if you like, call it that, is not to trust anything that the news say about you,
Mm,
and also not to trust the court system. And it was interesting because I became a sociologist afterwards, and I studied criminology,
mm.
and it was really interesting to be able to put what I'd experienced going through the court system and then the
As
prison
a
system.
criminal.
Yeah, and then I was able to understand it from a
Mm,
critical criminology point of view. And it's really, I mean, like one thing fundamental, which is a bit weird about a court case, is the prosecution go first. Now, essentially, what that means is that they erect this scaffold with all the facts and figures and all the rest of it. The defendant did this, the defendant did that, blah, blah, blah. And then it comes your turn, and you're there talking to your barrister or solicitor, and you're saying, well, there's lots of lies there. And they're going, well, yeah, we know that, but we can't say it's all lies. So what we've got to do is try and take the big bits down to try and damage their case. But we
mm.
can't say it's all lies because the public won't believe it. And also, the public don't want to believe it because, the court and the police and all that, they're supposed to protect us.
Right.
That's what, yeah. And so they're obviously not going to, listen to some long-haired layabout versus a police officer, right? And so if you say the guy's lying, it doesn't go down well, even though it's true, you know?
Hmm. Um, so how do you think the general public's view of direct action groups like the Animal Liberation Front has changed over time? You sort of addressed that on a smaller scale, I think, earlier, but I mean, you know, on a larger scale, from the 70s to now, how do you think the general public's view on direct action groups like the ALF has changed?
Well, I think that the state, to use that phrase, succeeded in kind of shutting us up quite well, although it didn't stop a lot of stuff. But certainly the kind of openness that we had, the open relationship we had with journalists, that kind of went. And then there was a lull in activities. I mean, don't forget when we were doing the press office, the ALF were doing 6 actions per night. in those days. So there was 6 ALF actions per night. And so
Wow, that is insane.
I know, I mean, you're lucky to get that, what, every 6 months now,
And
right?
that's
And
when the
so,
ALF was far smaller scale and not even a thing in the US, right? That's
yeah, I mean, we no, but we talk about Britain. That's 6
yeah, yeah.
per night in
That's
Britain. Yeah.
which has a much smaller population. Yeah, you do not see six. You do not even see six actions in the name of animal rights, let alone direct actions here in the U.S. That's
Yeah, of course, it can be the small things like a butcher's window
of
or
course,
gluing,
yeah,
yeah, and all that. And so there's an entire kind of range of things, but I think that also shows the impetus for the state to shut us down because we were growing and growing and growing, and because we had this kind of cell structure, it was difficult. So they had to use a non-vegan phrase, they had to kind of cut the head off the snake. So
hmm.
they went for the press office, right? And so that's how they did it. And I think it was successful. And then there's a lull, and then you start then to get the influencers coming in who are called militant vegans, and you get groups who hold laptops in the street, and they're now called the militant vegans, and it's a little bit amusing to us thinking back that
Right,
yeah, but it goes to show how people's memories and journalists' memories are short, and so I think that the state manages to change opinion. I think the fact that the national groups stopped supporting us was a big deal, and so that changed the opinion of the grassroots, the rank and file and all that. And so that was a problem. One of the ways that manifest was the fact that because I ended up starting a group called the Rescued Animals Sanctuary Fund, and the reason for that is that the homes dried up, right? And there's all kinds of really complicated reasons for that. But of course, rescuing beagles, rats and mice, whoever from a laboratory, for example, was very popular. The journalists loved it, and of course, the movement loved it, right?
right,
But then the homes started to dry up, and so the second part of the LF, which is economic sabotage, in other words, damage, became again kind of rose in
hmm.
kind of prevalence, if you like. And so we weren't able to kind of go to the press so often with our fluffy kind of stories of people coming out of laboratories holding beagles, which they absolutely adored, right? Because they knew that the public would. And so there was a problem, and the homes problem was often caused by the fact that it's very difficult. If you're an activist, I mean, I've been through this, you go into a unit which is full of our fellow animals, and there's 50,000 of them, and you've got homes for 56.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
so you end
that's
up acting like some god or something, and you're thinking, this is terrible. So what tends to happen is that the activists take out more than they should, in inverted commas,
hmm.
right? Which then puts a lot of pressure on the people who are taking them at the other end. Because what the activists want to do is they would often take them to a safe house for a while, everything calms down, and then they go to their permanent homes or sanctuary, whatever. But of course, they would arrive with more than they should, which puts a lot of burden on the sanctuary or the individual, and so they're then less likely to want to do it again. And then there was other things which were beyond our control. There was one very famous raid in Scotland where it was really interesting because we were working with Sea Shepherd a lot at the time, and so they had these marine CBs, which the police didn't monitor, so they were using them. It was quite, the press always said that we were professionals, which we weren't. It was just a ragtag type of thing. But on this occasion, it was pretty well organized, and so I think they ended up with about 32 beagles from a breeding unit, but each and every one was pregnant.
Hmm.
Right. And so again, at the other end, the people who had agreed to take a beagle would end up with a mother beagle with several pups. And so that was beyond our control. And so as the homes diminished, the kind of damage went up a little bit, and that's less popular either by the press or by the movement itself. So there was a kind of structural problem that we faced, really.
Hmm, I see. Yeah, I really wanted to focus on something you mentioned there, which is, that nowadays the people who are considered militant vegans are, well, externally the people who talk about it too much. That's the public's conception of a militant vegan, because I don't think that the ALF or these groups are nearly as much on people's radar now as they were even just a few
Yeah,
decades ago.
absolutely.
But even internally amongst vegans, I mean, the militant vegans that people think of are, as you mentioned, people who, stand around holding pictures of dead animals, or laptops showing slaughterhouse footage and stuff like that. I think a lot of times too, what these groups fail to do. So if you take Anonymous for the Voiceless, I'm not going to name names, but I will name. I will refer to individuals. If you look at Anonymous for the Voiceless, for example, certain people who are associated with that, most notably the person who runs their social media page, are actively against intersectionality. And I mean, the person who runs their social media page on his personal page, he's posted things saying intersectionals want to snatch the vegan movement away from, being about animals, and they want to turn it into a movement defending animal abusers. That's how he referred to
Yeah,
Palestinians,
definitely.
right? So
Yeah,
I mean,
you're in favor
it's
of the oppressors.
nonsensical.
Yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
it's nonsensical. Then you see figures like Gary Yourofsky talking about how they want to, how they wish that women who wear fur get raped or something like that, and disemboweled. And I think the word that you used in one of your videos to refer to it, which I really liked because it's a good word, is it's juvenile. It's juvenile. It's ridiculous. We're not going to do this. And if we do, we're going to realize what a horrible idea it is pretty quickly, right? And,
Mm.
it's just not something we should be going around talking about and saying if we want people to take us seriously. What do you think has led people like this in the movement to get, so much attention?
Well, Yourofsky had a big effect, I think. He was really the first person to understand what the internet was.
Mm,
And so he had a team of people. I remember it very clearly. For about 18 months or so, the team of people that anything animal related that came up on the new internet, they would go, "Oh, have you seen this?" And then you would post a link to the best speech and all that. Now, objectively, if you just
So
isolate,
I just want to say, when you said best speech, I started thinking about Stephen Best's speech and was very confused for a moment. Yes, the best speech you've ever
yeah,
heard, the video at Georgia
yeah,
Tech. I
that's
get it.
right.
Continue. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And so, I mean, obviously, again, in terms of marketing and everything, which is big now, I mean, the movement is more corporatized now than it's ever been, in my experience. So,
Right.
it's all to do with branding, marketing. Here I am, with this. But I mean, there's only one of these in existence. I wouldn't expect everybody to be wearing it. But
Of course.
um, so there was a lot of that going on where this speech was being pushed and pushed and pushed. And it was a good speech.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons why it was a good speech was the fact that Yourofsky was employed by Peter initially, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and he'd done it over and over and over again. And so the filming of it, it's a little bit like a stand-up comedian. They filmed the last couple of gigs. They don't film the beginning of their
Right.
tour, right? And so it's exactly the same as that. In fact, there was some early versions of that same speech on the internet where Yourofsky was kind of all over the place. And so
I have seen those.
those,
Yeah. Yeah. You can see him
yeah, so
noticeably
those
younger
have
too.
gone,
And yeah.
yeah, those have kind of been taken down. And
Hmm.
you've got this kind of pristine one. I mean, I was a lecturer, and so that once you do it a couple of times, you get to know the rhythm, you get to know what jokes work and all that. So on the face of it, just looking at it as content analysis or something, that speech is very good, right? The problem is the personality that was behind it,
Hmm.
you know. And the guy very individualistic, is a Zionist. He calls the Palestinians the most psychotic people on earth, and then all that sexualized violence that you talked about,
Yeah.
we,
Right.
yeah, which is a major problem. So the problem is we can't really have a violence fantasist being the spokesperson for the ultimate peace movement. It just doesn't fit. But a lot of the influencers now are massive Yurovsky fans, and they will
They
still,
are.
yeah, including AV, my favorite stolen group, from 2016. Now, people think that AV has been going on forever. It was 2016 when it was stolen, because it was taken away from some female activists in Australia. It wasn't formed by the people who are now
Hmm.
running it, and making a lot of money, by the way. And so, they've been involved with scandals. They had that scandal when, Carvstrong kind of got involved and all that, the money scandal and all the rest of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And now they're rebuilding again for the third time. I think that's what's going on with AV. The problem for me from AV goes back to the ALF, goes back to the grassroots, goes back to the local groups, which is the fact that we thought for ourselves. We were critical thinkers, whether we kind of knew it or not in kind of academic terms. We were, and so things were a lot more spontaneous. There was a lot of stuff going on, and it was kind of go go go, and all that, because there was a lot of people doing a lot of activism, but there was a lot of people doing a lot of organization and stuff. What groups like AV act as is counter-revolutionaries. They take away that kind of buzz, that kind of anarchic buzz, and instead they impose a corporation which is chock full of rules and regulations, and you've got a uniform to wear.
Right.
It's a very counter-revolutionary idea, and
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Right, no, that's true. I just wanted to contrast that with another group and ask your opinion on them. I'm sure you're familiar with coalitions who abolish the fur trade. I've had a few people on here speak about them, and it's modeled after SHAC. It's very decentralized. This is done, both in anarchist spirit and to also protect the people who participate in it. We don't have figureheads to go after, like we had the SHAC 7. What do you think of that?
well, I don't know a great. I mean, that's a North American organization, right? So I don't know a
Yeah,
great deal about them, but obviously anything which is decentralized, from my point of view, is a kind of good thing.
yeah.
Because you're then dealing with things like networking. I mean,
Mm.
I took part in for the first time for many years. I took part in the National Animal Rights March the other week, and it was great to network with people, and that's how we used to kind of do it. And now we've got the internet, which, from the face of it, we should be more organized and networked now than ever.
Right, yeah.
And it's not the case. So it's almost like a social psychology issue that we've got this glorious, I mean, we're doing it now. We've got
Yeah,
this glorious global instant technological communication system.
yeah.
And yet we don't seem to be able to get our shit together as a movement very well.
Right, exactly. Yeah, my prior guest Peter Young talked about that. He said he thinks the internet's been a net negative for pretty much everything, every single aspect of our culture except for making money, is what he said, and I could certainly agree there. But yeah, no. Another thing he mentioned. I mean, I'm very new to the movement, but I believe it when he says, well, the math doesn't check out. I mean, before the internet, we had way more people coming to events and whatnot than we do nowadays. And nowadays I'm in Facebook groups. Like I'm in a Facebook group for Worcester, Massachusetts, with over 1,000 people. And I mean, not even 5% of those people are dedicated because, the events that we organize have about 20 to 30 people going. It's
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure Ronnie talked about this because that's Ronnie's big thing at the moment. That he wants vegan education everywhere and all the time,
right, right.
and we don't have the infrastructure for that. And it is true that the national corporations, which are all kind of competing for the same vegan dollar, as it were, they don't help. I don't think the influencers particularly help.
Mm,
The influencers are not good at sharing information. You don't see them kind of going, "Oh, check out this by Tom Reagan" and all that. They
right.
don't do that. They're very kind of self-absorbed in that sense, and
Yeah.
they see themselves.
What you'll see on social media from influencers is usually like pictures of animals being stabbed or something like that, and then a speech bubble filled with what the person wants that animal to say. I just don't understand. I mean, that's actually the dominant animal rights post in among certain accounts that are highly followed on social media that I've seen. I just don't understand what that's meant to provide
Well,
us.
mm, I think a lot of them would push back on that and say, well, look, we've done our research. We know what works in the internet age, in the social media
Mm,
age. We know what pushes people's buttons and everything. What it doesn't do is create activists. And
that is
that
true. Yeah.
on the face of it, that's the most important thing. And if you're not creating activists, they're just turning up to your events, as it were. That's not kind of good enough, really, from a social movement perspective. But that goes back to Yurovsky. I remember Yurovsky saying, "Oh, I'm not a politician." In other words, he was basically saying, "I'll say what I want and to hell with it," kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he didn't take any responsibility for being seen as a spokesperson for a social movement. And I was told recently by an author, actually, that his kind of, he's working on his third book, I think. He was saying that people in the movement now don't see themselves as being in the movement. So when you look at the founding values and writings of the people who formed the vegan social movement or the British Vegan Society in the 40s, they talked about being in a movement, they talked about being in a cause, they talked about being in a radical reform, this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that that's the psychology of the modern day activists who maybe see themselves as part of a little tight group, or wear the same stuff. But I don't think that they see themselves as part of a bigger thing that
Right.
we used to do that all the time because it was just true for us, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
That.
perhaps it's not true for them. I don't know.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, I don't know. Like, I routinely meet people who are vegan, and yeah, I routinely meet people who are vegan and are actively hostile towards animal rights as well. Because I mean, they call themselves vegan. Really, what I mean is plant-based eaters and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And often, well, what's the case is actually their parents believe in animal rights. They just haven't passed those ideas down. They've just raised their children with a diet. I'm not sure exactly how
Well,
that
again, you
happens,
see,
but that's
well, we've got a structural problem there in the sense that I mean I'm pretty furious on a daily basis about the way that the animal rights movement treated Tom Reagan,
oh yeah,
which was an absolute scandal. You
it
know,
was. Yeah.
they broke his back and they broke his heart, and this was because the actual animal rights movement is really an animal welfare movement, or what Francione would call a new welfare movement.
Hmm.
And so this is why, I mean, there's a big campaign going on, almost unbelievably for my generation at the moment, against the RSPCA from new welfarists like Joey Carbstrong and stuff. And the reason that I would classify them as new welfarists is that they have got this model which seems to be welfare plus welfare plus welfare will equal animal rights. And so they
Mm.
talk the language of welfare. The favorite word of this movement at the moment, although it sees itself as militant and radical, is cruelty. The same favorite word as the RSPCA. The second favorite word is animal abuse. The second favorite word of the RSPCA. So there's no wonder that we've now got this kind of new welfare movement trying to regulate the RSPCA, who are trying to regulate animal use, right? And so new welfarism is really kind of, it's like a version of welfare with a vegan cherry on the top, because they always go vegan, even
Mm.
though it's really interesting because from the cultural point of view, bringing in a bit of sociology, is there's no connection between cruelty-free or don't be cruel or have mercy and all this kind of stuff. There's no connection between those ideas and veganism. None at
Right.
all. There's no cultural connection.
In fact, I mean, if you look in society, I mean, it's the dominant view that. So I mean, I would consider, taking a being, breeding it into existence, manipulating its entire life, and then killing it for, a consumer product. I mean, I would consider that cruel. But I mean, that's not how we use animal cruelty in popular discourse. There are very few people out there that think that animals have zero, yeah, have zero consideration. The typical stance that most people have is a welfarist stance. It's like, Okay, you can't beat up a cow. Often they'll say, okay, if the cow suffers because of, its conditions, because of her conditions, that's okay. But if a human isn't beating the cow, then if the human's beating the cow, that's the problem. So animal cruelty is wrong, but killing an animal to eat it is okay. I mean, that's the dominant view. Like, why are we talking about that? People agree with us, and all they're going to do is claim whether or not this be true. Oh no, we aren't, needlessly actively killing these animals while we're actively hurting these animals while we're exploiting and killing them. It's
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
you're invoking the kind of ins and outs of cultural speciesism, and one major plank of cultural speciesism is animal welfareism. And so we teach our children, don't be cruel, have mercy, and all this kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean don't use them.
hmm,
Culturally, it just doesn't mean it. And so even that meme that we often put around, which is, why kill one and eat the other? It's because culturally there's no problem there. Now,
right.
so we've got to challenge that. Our number one target is cultural
I
speciesism.
assume you
Now,
mean why kill one and love the other.
yeah, is that not
No,
what I said?
I think you said why kill one and eat the other,
Oh,
but
eat the other. Okay, yeah,
that's
no,
okay. No, no,
yeah,
no. But
yeah,
I
that's the
wanted
one.
to no, I wanted to emphasize for the audience. I mean, yeah, I mean, like most people don't see a contradiction between, and I mean there isn't a technical logical contradiction, but most people don't see anything strange about having a dog and then having a dog as a pet and taking care of the dog and killing and eating a pig because you want to eat pork. Like most people don't see a difference between those two, and that's just because we think of animals as beings on which we can place subjective value that just depends on our own sort of ideas, because fundamentally they're not other moral patients, they're property. So if you love your dog, that's like loving a stuffed toy.
Yeah, well, they are moral
That's of
patients, aren't they? They're not moral agents. And so
course.
I agree with you. People have a functionalist view of our relationships with our fellow animals. And so, which is why when you talk to them, they're forever saying, well, that's what they're for. So that's how they
Right,
think.
right,
You
yeah.
know, what is this being for? Well, pets are for petting, which is a form of animal use, and food animals are for eating, right?
Right.
It's a functional view, which is often why you get that outrage when a foreign country seems to get it wrong, and the ones who should be pets are the ones who end up on the dinner plate, and that's what outrages people.
Mm.
It's not the fundamentals, it's the fact that they almost like seem to be making a mistake from our cultural point of view, in the
Well,
same way. So
it doesn't always outrage my generation, I have to add. I meet a lot of people who think they're coming off cool and cosmopolitan by saying, "Oh yeah, I eat a dog. There's no problem with eating dog. I eat pigs." And I'm like, think I think your modus ponens is my modus tollens there.
yeah, and also there's obviously a lot of bravado and all that,
Yeah,
but
it's
I mean, people will say virtually anything, really, and the interesting thing, of course, is in a deeply speciesist society, speciesists can say the most ridiculous things, and other speciesists will go, "Yeah, you're right," right?
yeah.
Whereas what they've actually said doesn't really make any logical sense. It doesn't make any philosophical sense. Doesn't make any moral sense. But they're right because it's kind of what they also want to do. But we get trained to be animal welfareists. So there's this modern day kind of activism which could, in my view, be really useful. What it's based on is asking people on the street, "Are you against animal cruelty?" And they say yes. "Are you against animal abuse? And what do you think that means?" And when they describe it in the way that we'd expect. You know, they talk about cats and dogs and beating horses, all the stuff that you've just alluded to, right? So they do all that. And then there's a bit of a gotcha. The activists go, and what about the slaughterhouses, right? And then the people go blank for a little bit and go, "Oh, well, that's a different thing," and all that kind of stuff. Now, that's when their cultural understanding starts to kind of buzz in their head a little bit. Now, that's the time when vegan education should begin. What happens in this form of activism is the activist then starts calling them an abuser and calling them names and stuff. And so the opportunity, because you think they're constructing this in order to educate, they're actually constructing this because it's good on YouTube to get your clicks from
Right.
other vegans who go, yeah, you showed him, you showed her, all this kind of stuff. And so the opportunity to educate has lost. And I think that the modern day movement doesn't really care that much about vegan education. I think it's now to do with this phrase, holding the oppressor to account,
Yeah,
which is,
holding like a random homeless guy who walked up to your cube accountable for what a corporation does. I hate that stuff. I mean, I've seen it in person, and I'm just like, no, this is not right. This is not what we.
no, but I mean, it's shallow. That's the real problem with it.
Yeah,
I mean, like we are human beings. Um, you know, I don't like this rhetoric now about we're the oppressors, because we are, but we're also the liberators.
right.
Leslie Cross, one of the pioneers, said we're on the side of the liberators. Well, and another thing that gets my goat, am I allowed to say that? Is when people go, it's not our movement, it's their movement. Well, this technically is not true, because you don't see, our fellow animals do not organize themselves into social movements or social movement organizations. They just
Right.
don't. We do. So we are the liberators. We are also, as a species, the oppressors. There's no doubt about that. But
Yeah.
to just dismiss, and that goes back to Yurovsky and the fact that he hates humanity. He declared once that he hates humanity, including vegans. Right. Now, I mean, where, from a social movement point of view, can you go with that? It's so
Exactly.
shallow and naive and silly and
And I think
juvenile.
I think I mean, if someone's a misanthrope, that's okay. But I mean, that's your personal attitude. It's not the attitude of the movement. It's not an attitude we need shouted out everywhere. It's not something that's gonna, help the animals. But yeah, for some reason,
Well, I
misanthropy
think
is just
so. Another thing that I've noticed in recent years, and this is very baffling to me, is the fact that this rhetoric of animal lover has come back into the movement.
hmm,
Back in the 80s, we would completely resist that. One reason for being is that we would dismiss the RSPCA of being the animal lovers. We weren't that. We are the animal liberators, and we're the animal respecters. Going back to the Now, they have a short clip which from the Animals film, which came out in 1981, and they say, we're not animal lovers. We respect animals, but we don't love them like we respect our neighbors, but we don't have to love them.
hmm,
You just don't have to. Uh, our fellow animals don't really need our love,
right.
but they could really benefit if they were respected. So I think the way that some of the modern day animals only vegans have worked it out is that if they can get a movement full of animal lovers focused solely on our fellow animals, then it doesn't matter about people's politics, Hitler, Trump, whoever. I mean, there is a Facebook group, Vegans for Trump. I mean, how is that possible? And so you
And
could
Gary
get,
Yourofsky's vegan Zionism is just way too
yeah,
popular since
that's right. So you
October
can get all that,
7th. Yeah.
grab a pussy veganism, and
Oh,
so you can have all that. And the way they figure it is that our fellow animals don't care about your politics, because again, we're back to that thing, is they don't see themselves as being part of a movement.
hmm.
They just think that they can get this group of animal lovers together and bring about animal liberation and keep all the sexism and racism and everything else. Whereas anybody with any kind of philosophical um, kind of sophistication have always seen that it's all got to come down. It's like the Berlin Wall. It's got to come down all at once, and so everybody sees that. The feminists have said it with logic of domination. David Nybert said it with, entanglements of oppression and liberation and all that. It's kind of obvious if you think about it. The idea that you're just going to be able to get sufficient people to be able to bring about animal liberation and nothing else is completely beyond fanciful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you've spoken about the movement counter movement dialectic. What does this mean in the context of animal rights?
Well, there's always a dialectic. Usually, what you get is you get the formation of a movement, and then you get a formation of the counter movement.
Hmm.
So the kind of definition of a social movement is a group of people who come together to bring about change, or resist change. So that's your dialectic straight away. So you've got some people who want to bring about change, and then you get other people who want to resist the change that those people want to do. So that's always been the duality of a movement and counter movement. Because I use the work of somebody called Richard Gale, a sociologist, and instead of talking about the kind of duality, he talks about a triad, and he says that what you've got here, this is a really weird one from a rights welfare point of view. Instead of just having a movement and its counter movement, you've also got to take into account state agencies. So you've got a triangle, right? Now, the state can talk to the counter movement better than they can to the movement because they're trying to resist.
Hello, Roger? Hello? You've cut out your audio. There we go.
Yeah, sorry,
All right, okay, yeah.
I must have just brushed that. Yeah, what the state do is they talk to the counter movement about animal welfare reforms, because it's the same with all states and politicians. They can't talk to us seriously about animal rights because animal rights is far too radical for politicians. And that's why they either translate it into animal welfare or they come up with some legislation which is totally rubbish, like the hunting ban in Britain, for example.
Yeah,
And
or
so
the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the US, which is just nonsense. I mean, you're gonna put people who flew planes into buildings under the same label as someone who throws a brick through the window of a McDonald's. It's just, ugh.
well, you know, it is just the function of the fact that the basis of our culture is welfarist, as you were saying before. You know, everybody is an animal welfarist, right? Very few are vegans. And so there's a disconnect that we've got.
And very few people think what we call animal abuse or cruelty, which is people just going up to animals that are being exploited and torturing them for fun, is okay. No one thinks that. So when we put out footage of people doing that and say, oh, this is why you should be vegan, it doesn't have any motivating power.
No, and because they're welfarists, their first kind of question, either verbally or in their head, is, which one can I eat then? We used to get that a lot when we formed the VIP in Dublin in 2013. A lot of people used to come up and go, well, what meat can I eat then? Because that's how they saw it. They were kind, you know, you're opposing to flesh consumption.
Yeah.
But tell me which one is okay.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I mean, I know of, I don't know him very personally because of what he does, a cattle rancher who won't eat chicken. And that's because he just doesn't like the way that factory farms raise chicken. He says it's ethics. It really sounds more like health from the way he talks about it. But it's like, right, like well, if your opposition is just the way the animal is treated, or, you know, factory farming as opposed to animal use, you're gonna get to conclusions like that. And I mean, this guy's eating a bunch of beef because it's easy to find beef in this country that doesn't come from factory farms. It's still not okay to eat those, so, you know.
No, but I suppose you couldn't scale that up to the entire population either, could you? So
no, you couldn't. No.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, really, people's response to us is always based on the fact that at the core values, they're animal welfarists. You know, which is why it seems to me useful to stand outside of that and say, okay, well, you're a welfarist, we're on animal rights, let's talk about the difference. It's like when you get to that third question in this routine and going, well, what do you think about the slaughterhouses? And they, oh, that's different. And say, well, let's explore why you think it's different.
Right.
That's where the education is, right?
Exactly. Everything else is just paving the stage for there being some kind of ethic towards animals that isn't welfarism. So, yeah.
That's it, you know, and I'm not convinced that trying to create a direct line with no kind of argumentation between anti-cruelty and veganism is going to work, because I think it needs, it's that's a journey for people to go on. It's not just an obvious kind of, oh yeah, you know, are you going to have a conversation with somebody on the street, give them your little card, and bingo, you've got a vegan. Now, even groups like AV realized that that was fanciful. And so they
Right.
had to change, they changed, they used to have the tally and all that. They changed all that because they realized that it wasn't working the way that they assumed it would. Because AV is really based on kind of pop and sales psychology in the same way as Melanie Joy and all that is, which is why they work in that kind of area of speaking to people in that kind of corporatized kind of grifter kind of way. You meet people on the street, and you know people try and sign you up to a website or something. I used to funny. I used to when they first started. I used to be very angry with them. I used to go up to them and say, you've ruined it for us. Because if I think back to the 80s, and this is totally true in Liverpool, people used to come up to us to get leaflets off us to find out what we're all about. Especially during the miners' strike, it was kind of a lot of information. And when you think of it, this is the bedrock of democracy. One citizen giving information to another citizen to consider. And now these corporatized versions of it have made people frightened of the information. It happened to me. I moved to Wales, and one day I was walking down the high street past Holland and Barrett, and this guy offered me a leaflet, and I took it, and he held on to it. And so we were doing a bit of a tug of war thing, and I was going, what? And then I went, okay, mate, if you want to keep it, keep it. And I let go of it and went. But it was his way of holding me there to try and, get me signed up to something. Which we would never do that before. We just give them the leaflet, or they would come up and ask for a leaflet. It's
Yeah.
kind of changed the relationship because people are almost like afraid to get information on the street now, whereas people used to welcome it, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, that's right. People aren't afraid to get all kinds of nonsensical information off of social media, though.
No, no, no. Yeah, irony.
Exactly. So, what are your thoughts on the use of violence in the animal rights movement? By violence, I mean actual violence, not property destruction or civil disobedience.
Well, I'm opposed to it, and this is why the ALF had a non-violence thing. Obviously, you have to get into issues like self-defense,
Yeah.
violence in that sense. And I take my lead from a political scientist called Herbert Marcuse on that. That a violence that somebody is resisting versus the violence of the oppressor. To go back to that language, that's a different thing, and you can't regard it as the same. And I suppose we're seeing that playing out in Palestine right now. So I think that there's a place for it in terms of self-defense. There's not really a place for it in the ultimate peace movement, which is veganism. Yeah, and so that's what. Going back to Ronnie, I was considering should I do the non-press officer and everything, and I think if they hadn't had that policy of non-violence, I wouldn't have done it.
I see. Well, you brought up self-defense. What do you think about Steve Best's concept of extensional self-defense?
That is really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, you kind of you look across the street. It's 7 a.m. and there's a vivisector getting into their car, and you know where they're going, right? So if you take action against them, then the violence that they were definitely going to go and do is prevented. So I think it's an interesting one and quite difficult. I'd invoke Reagan, who often would say that's a difficult question, and I think that one is quite a difficult question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what Reagan argues is what I'd argue, which is in the hypothetical we've set up, it's a difficult question because if killing him is the only way to prevent animals from dying, but I mean, in real life, that's not. Violence is not our only resort for extensional self-defense. There's so many other ways in which we can defend animals, so many other things we can do.
Yeah, well, I suppose fans of extensional self-defense might say, well, look, it's a great help to those that individual didn't get to kill that day. So you do have that argument. This is what makes it.
Well, I mean, if they're lab animals, they're just going to be killed by someone else or euthanized at the end. So I just think, I only bring that up because, like, I think practically, I just don't really see situations in which it makes sense. I mean, certainly not real life ones, because there's many other things we could do. I mean, in the situation we just brought up, like, yeah, if you set up a trolley problem, and that's the factors, that's one thing. But in real life, there's other factors that we have to take into account that we can change, which is the fact that those animals are going to be killed or vivisected or something at the end. They're not going to be liberated if that person's killed. The only thing that will save them is going out and liberating them, which of course is something that I am not going to
And the
condemn one
ultimate
bit.
thing,
Yeah,
the ultimate thing which will lead to liberation is cultural change.
that's
I
right.
mean, that's got to be the bedrock of what we're at, which is we're back to cultural speciesism again. It's our number one target, and I've always argued that if we can't do anything about it, if it's too strong for us, then all we can do is tinker at the edges and do welfare and stuff. And I
Hmm.
think quite a few people conclude that that we're not really going to get it. I think there is an element of pessimism. I tend to try to remain optimistic because for me it's the best way forward because I want total liberation. And so for me to start rowing back on that,
Hmm.
it doesn't fit my personality at all. So I kind of resist it.
I see. Um, so flash to the modern day, speciesism is so deeply imbued within our culture, and it seems like it's only getting stronger over time. What do you think social media and celebrity culture and things like that have had to do with this?
Um, well, one thing that hasn't helped, I don't think, is the rise of this vegetarian concept called carnism. I
Uh,
think that is kind of badly affected our claims making. And so rather than keeping the focus on speciesism where it should be, it's based on carnism. And even the person who coined it, Melanie Joy, said it was a subset, a sub-ideology, she called it. In fact, she said that it was like anti-Semitism and its relationship with anti-racism. So it was never about the fundamental wrong.
Yeah,
You know,
I saw you on Reddit a while discussing something specific about that term, which I made a mental note of, and which is so true. Is I mean, something that's meant to describe the mainstream term, something that's meant to describe a sociological concept, and as you'd argue, doesn't do a very good job at it, is now just turned into an insult. Like, oh, you're not a vegan, you're a carnist, and it's like, you know,
Yeah, well, Melanie
what?
Joy had to react to that because she
Mm,
said that she doesn't use the word carnist, but she will use the word carnism. So she
mm,
would she would want to kind of put it back into society in that sense. Although, of course, she's a psychologist, but she realized that carnism was being used as an insult. You're a carnist,
yeah.
So and of course, it's not the same if you say you're a speciesist, right? It's not the same as you're a carn. There's a bit of a snarl about it, isn't there?
Mm,
You're a carnist. So I think that's why activists like it, even though it doesn't actually do what they want to do,
yeah.
in theory anyway.
I mean, I think speciesism is the best way to is the best term to use to describe the relationship that human beings have with animals. But unfortunately, the reason why people don't pick up on it, and people always sound very intelligent saying this to me, is they'll say, "Oh, the difference between speciesism and racism is that all races are equal and all species aren't equal," or something like that. And it's so it's okay to be prejudiced or something like that. And it's like it's just missing the point. So like it also just has to do with the way that we're defining racism. I mean, if we have the sort of liberal, like, concept of like ontological individualism, where racism is just, oh, personal prejudice or something like that, and we're not explaining it sociologically using the systems of hierarchy and domination that are in place, then yeah, you're not gonna understand why, the concept of speciesism, you're not gonna be motivated by that. But if you understand that concept of racism, and you transfer it over to see that there are systems of domination that allow one species, human beings, to, exploit, kill, etc., have this hierarchy over other species, and that no, there's nothing natural about it when it's existing in an industrialized capitalist society. I mean, I fail to see how anyone could reject that possibility, but the reason why that concept, but the reason why people don't accept it is because of their concepts of what racism and sexism are, which is just personal prejudice.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, David Nibert makes that point in the fact that sociologists see speciesism as a deeply socially embedded ideology and not just prejudice that individuals hold. And
Right,
so
right.
there, so
And I think
therefore,
it's well, it is John Sonban Matsu. He says, who disclosure I personally know, says it's a mode of production.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so and it goes straight across people saying things like, "Oh, morality is subjective," and all that kind of stuff. It gets to the heart of the problem. Some
Most people
people,
who say morality is subjective do not have any philosophical arguments for it, in my because I think
well,
moral
no,
anti-realism is an interesting thing, but something
and
that
also
everyone,
you
including moral anti-realists to moral nihilists, agrees on is that we should still conserve moral discourse. I mean, that metaphysical thesis is not a way to throw away your responsibility as a human being.
and on a practical level, you try using that in court and see how far it gets you.
That's what I
But
mean. We conserve that discourse, yeah.
I mean, there are some activists, and Ronnie might have said this to you because I think this is his position that he prefers to use phrases like human supremacism, and he's even used phrases like the human Reich, which is quite interesting. In fact, I remember,
Sanbon Matsu uses that too, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, I know that Steve Best thought that was a really great phrase when Ronnie used it in front of him once.
Hmm.
So yeah, so yeah, the human Reich, but of course
Yeah.
that's going to get you into all kinds of trouble using that, I imagine, in this day and age.
Steve Vest said a lot of things that I wish people were more willing to say these days. That's for sure. Uh, um, so I always end every question. I always end every episode with a viewer question. But this time I decided to ask the viewer question. I guess I've been viewing you this whole time, so who better? So, what are some of your favorite films that explore themes relating to animal rights?
That's actually quite difficult. There is a recent one by a British filmmaker called Andy Atkinson.
I see.
It's called Animal Rights, We're Getting It Wrong. That's quite interesting. Well, and I'm not saying that just because I'm in it, but I am in it as well. But right in it. I tend to go back to the animals film, but it's really interesting. I got into trouble with the director, Victor
Mhm.
Schonfeld, because I used to describe it, and I've stopped doing it because it upset Victor so much. I used to describe it as my generation's Earthlings, and he really objected to it because he thought that his film was much more, so superior to that. And
That's funny.
so because he did see the animals film, and it is true, as a cinematic experience rather than just a documentary made up of rough cuts and stuff, as
Yeah,
it were.
I don't typically. Perhaps I did a few years ago. I don't typically. If people ask me about veganism, I do not typically show them slaughterhouse documentaries. Like it's just something that people will watch a few minutes of and tune out of. I'd much rather get into the practicalities of. I like. Sometimes I show them the film Behind the Mask, the story of the Animal Liberation Front, because that's got a lot of interesting perspectives there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is a controversial lie in that film, which is interesting.
Oh, really? What is it?
Um, there's a bit of footage in that film that I took as well. I don't know if you remember. There was a couple of baby goats coming through a fence, very very quick ski. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, I remember that.
yeah. I can't remember whether I was filming that or whether I was doing the business, but I was there. But the controversial thing is because one thing that started to create controversy within the ALF ranks, if you like, was the use of arson, right? And it's because it's incredibly useful. At the same time, you can't control fire,
Mm.
right? And also, there's no such thing as an empty building, and there's also no
You
such
always have
thing.
insects and rodents. Ronnie Lee brought that up last episode and it blew my mind. I never thought about it. And I think about actually they were founded in the UK, but I think historically they've been more active here. I mean, the Earth Liberation Front, I mean, they're most of them are not strict vegans or certainly not all of them are. And I remember, things like them burning down the ski resort in Vail in Colorado. It's like I'm
Yeah.
sure that killed at least a few animals, and in quite a painful way too.
Well, this is it because I mean, I remember Ronnie back in the early 80s, he wrote this article saying, this ties it into the film, saying you should get on the roof and check for nesting birds and
Mm,
et cetera, et cetera. But of course you can't check for nesting rats and mice and the smaller other animals. And it's just not possible. And so it says in the film that they tend to try come back several times to make sure the building is empty. Well, even that wouldn't work. And plus the fact activist groups are actually very reluctant to do that because it
mm.
means that they're increasing their chances of
Chances of
getting
getting caught, right?
caught. Yeah, and so it tends not to happen in that kind of way. Plus the fact it can't happen as an ultimate. This building is definitely empty. Kind of suggests. I mean, even a vehicle. There's no such thing as an empty vehicle because I've never had a car or seen a van without spiders in the wing mirrors and this kind of stuff, right? And so there's just no such thing. So when they're kind of burning down the meat trucks, they're also killing those individuals.
Mm.
When we interviewed Urofsky years ago, I put that point to him that there's no such thing as an empty building, and he said he didn't understand the question. So I guess that's
That's really funny.
so I guess that's where his
Well,
head was. But
yeah.
so it caused problems in that sense, in the sense that kind of it ultimately makes the LF utilitarian,
It
doing it
does,
that
yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. It would depend on if you thought it was a rights violation. I can totally see some formations of, some deontic ideas that would say that's not a rights violation. But
Yeah. Do you know the recent arguments based on deontology about crop deaths is not really a vegan issue because there's no rights violations and also
that
there's
is mostly put forth by a few individuals on YouTube, like Ask Yourself, if you know him.
yeah.
Yeah, and Avi, and yeah, I mean, they don't even have any normative ethic. They just talk about threshold deontology.
Yeah,
I don't know. I
I think threshold deontology is a relatively new concept, isn't it? I mean, it certainly wasn't around with
it,
at
it,
Reagan's
it,
time, I don't think.
no, it's a new concept, but also I'm not really sure of the utility of it because there are forms of deontology that aren't absolutist, like Rossian deontology, where you have conflicting duties. So I that's what
Hmm.
I am. I'm a Rossian
Are
deontologist.
you
So
familiar with Richard Ryder's work
I
on
am, yeah, yeah,
Painism? Yeah, and so
yeah.
he,
Painism,
he
yeah. That's
yeah he claims that it's an interesting blend between deontology and utilitarianism, taking the best of both. He claims, and so he would then talk, about language and that carnism. He would talk about panience because
interesting.
yeah, because he was always based on pain. And you talked about what films I'd recommend. There was a famous BBC film which has been found recently, and Andy Atkinson has enhanced it. It's a bit dodgy in terms of its production values, although it was a BBC thing. There was a BBC program called Arena, and they had something called Animal Night. And the last 90 minutes or so was a debate featuring Tom Reagan and Richard Ryder and Andrew Lindsay, if you know who that is.
I do not know that person.
Yeah, he's a like animal rights theologian,
Oh,
and
okay.
he once came out with this really kind of interesting concept of there's no pure land. In other words, you can never get perfection. So it's perfectionism and all that. In the same way as Ryder came up with this idea of that there's always this thought within animal welfarism that our fellow animals need human superintendents, which I thought was a really interesting kind of thing. Anyway, this debate was watched on the night by 1 million people, apparently.
Mm.
And Reagan had this team of people, and then there was another team led by Baroness Mary Warnock. And so there was a to and fro, and then it went over to the audience. And that now is on Andy's YouTube channel, which is called Not Your Mum Dot Not Your Milk.
Oh, okay.
I think he's also put his name in it now as well, Andy in a bracket, I think, because I think there's a few channels like that. But that entire debate is there. And if you're interested in the distinction between animal rights and animal welfare, then that is an excellent thing, because the audience, most of them, can't get their head around animal rights, but they all know everything about animal welfare like everybody else. And it's really quite interesting. But the opening speech by Reagan, which has been separated out.
Oh, I think I've seen that speech then. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, I regard
Okay.
that as probably a quintessential statement of animal rights. It's only about 8 minutes long. And
Yes.
he,
Okay,
he
that's the
really
one I
kind
see.
of pretty much nails it right from the start to finish.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to check that out. And to anyone watching, make sure to check out those films that Roger recommended. Thank you so much, Roger, for joining me today. It was a great discussion.
You're welcome.
So much to share. Thank you so much.
Yes, a pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks.